the Stoney Nakoda nations, and I am Cree, originally from the Matthias Colomb Cree Nation, as well as I have family that are from the Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation as well in Saskatchewan. I am also a proud owner of my company called Musqua Productions and Consulting, and I've operated that now for 20 years. Prior to that, I was a journalist working as a reporter, worked with CBC, CTV, Global, and when APTN first launched 20 some years ago. So I definitely have curiosity. I guess that's what really makes one of the things a reporter and communications and commentator a good one, to always the willingness to learn. And we're taught that by our elders to be always open and to be listening more than speaking. So I am excited to be moderating this panel with such distinguished panelists that are here today, that are joining us. And I'm going to introduce our first panelist. As you might recognize, Niigaan. He has been on national television and worked in many areas. He's originally Anishinaabe from St. Peter's, Little Peguis, and is an associate professor at the University of Manitoba. He is an award-winning writer, editor, and activist who was named one of Monocle's magazine's Canada's top 20 most influential people. And he won the 2018 Canadian Columnist of the Year at the National Newspaper Awards for his bi-weekly columns in the Winnipeg Free Press, which I might add is, I read them and I think you're a wonderful writer, Niigaan. So he also won the Peace Educator of the Year from the Peace and Justice Studies Association based in Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He's an international media commentator as a part of the Power panel on CBC's Power and Politics and a national affairs panel on CBC's The Current. He is also a former secondary school teacher who has trained educators and students across Canada on Indigenous issues, education, and reconciliation. Please welcome Niigaan Sinclair.
All right, so bonjour, Ndidwe Maganaduk, Niigaanwewidam, Nidijdakas, Namagoshin, Dodem, Niigaanwewidam, Omayayin. Bonjour, Mishumasak, Nakomasak, Mijanakijik, Namiji Nibikwe. It's a pleasure to be here and share with you the language of the territory, talk a little bit about my family, and talk a little bit about, of course, my ancestors yet to come. And so it's an honor to be here. We're going to talk a little bit today about some important things around residential schools, intergenerational harm, and some other things that our colleagues are working on in terms of thinking about what is the impact and the issues around residential schools. And of course, this talk is being brought to you by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and the wonderful work that they do to bring light, to bring bridge understanding and knowledge in lots of different ways, so that we all, as people within this project, these communities, these territories, many of whom you're seeing, one of the most amazing things is seeing everybody talking about their territories in the chat. So if everybody could just take a look at your chat, and you'll see this wonderful array of all the different territories and people talking about which communities they come from. And all the relationships that you share result. I come to you from Treaty 1 territory, the homeland of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Lakota, Nakota, Dakota peoples, and we also have relatives in the Dene and Inuit who are coming from the north. And then, of course, we are in the homeland of the Métis Nation, right smack dab in where the Métis Nation was birthed, right here. And so, we're very honored to be here to be able to talk to you about something that's very passionate to me and of course to my family. A lot of you may or may not know, but you may know that my father, of course, is Senator Murray Sinclair. So I bring greetings on behalf of him and the former commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and now doing a whole bunch of things. But of course, my daughter just calls him Mushum. And so I bring greetings from all of those different sectors. What we want to do is we want to offer the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. We have board member Roy Pogarzelski, who is coming to us. He's Métis from Saskatchewan, comes from the communities of Green Lake, Meadow Lake, and Batoche. And of course, to list off all your different accomplishments, Roy, I'll simply just call you my brother over there, since I've known you for such a long time, and we've known each other from our days way back in First Nations University, and when my very first job was over there. But Roy, you've done work in human rights. You've an award-winning human rights advocate. You've also been named top 40 under 40 in Lethbridge. And are you still under 40? Are you getting old like I am? But you still look great.
We'll turn 40 in February. There we go.
I was thinking you're getting closer to me, but I still hold on to my top 40 under 40 award as well. So Roy, if you could bring some words from the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinclair. And hello and welcome to all of you who have taken the time to participate in this important webinar series. As Dr. Sinclair mentioned, my name is Roy Pogarzelski, and I'm a board member here for the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land I am speaking to you from is Treaty 7 territory, the traditional territory of the Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, and here in Lethbridge, Kainai and Piikani Nations, Nakota Stoney and Tsuut'ina Nations, and also Métis Nation Region 3. And as Dr. Sinclair mentioned, I'm Cree or Métis Cree from northern Saskatchewan, from the communities of Green Lake and Meadow Lake in the north, and it's a pleasure to be here as on behalf of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, but even more of a pleasure to be here with our panelists and our moderator, Nicole, all of which I've had a pleasure of knowing and meeting and on this journey that we call life. And Dr. Fontaine has been one of my mentors, and I was one of her students about 20 years ago. So I learned a lot from Dr. Fontaine along the way. And of course, Dr. Sinclair, he taught me how to write an academic curriculum vitae briefly. So I really appreciated that. And I got to meet Nicole this past year. She graciously volunteered her knowledge to speak to our Indigenous tech incubator cohort to some of our young entrepreneurs. So what an opportunity to be here today. To date, nearly 7,500 unmarked graves have been discovered at former residential schools across the country. The stories and histories behind those graves have shaped generations of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities across Turtle Island. Our goal with this webinar is to help all Canadians understand the history and intent behind the residential school system and the ripple effect it has had on Indigenous people and how it shaped the trajectory of Canadian history. We will not solve the wrongs committed over the 160 plus years of the residential school system this afternoon, but it is important that we speak the truth to begin our healing journeys and put ourselves on a pathway towards true reconciliation. I thank all of you for participating, and I'll now hand over the discussion to our moderator, Nicole Robertson. And Nicole, I have a brief bio. Do you mind if I read it for you? Just
Sure,
excellent. Okay. So Nicole Robertson is a proud Woodland Cree from Treaty 6 and a seasoned journalist, broadcaster, and writer who has worked for APTN, Global Network, and CTV. In 2000, she created Musqueam Productions and Consulting, which specializes in communications advisory services. Musqueam Productions was recognized by the Alberta Chamber of Commerce with the Aboriginal Woman Entrepreneur Award. Miss Robertson was the first Indigenous woman to be a board member with Travel Alberta. So Nicole, please take it away.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Roy. And it's so nice to hear. Actually, we're in the same treaty territory. And I was so honored to work with Roy when he had asked me, to speak on the tech incubator. And thank you so much for this invitation. I am really honored to be amongst this distinguished panel, and I'm looking forward to some of the discussion. So thank you, Roy, for even, bringing this forward as a board member. You've done tremendous work in our community. So thank you for that. I sort of skipped over, and my apologies. Like, here we go. So I am wanting to let everyone know that there's a French interpretation if you are pressing the globe button in the bottom corner to get the interpretation, you can do that through Zoom. And just a couple of things that we need to make mention. And then I think that we are going to go back to Niigaan on his presentation, and we thank you for that, and we look forward to seeing what you're going to be presenting. So thank you. I will give you the floor, Niigaan.
Okay, great. So yeah, miigwech. Sorry, I'm by an airport and my cat refuses to let me close the window. So if you hear a little bit of, if it gets too loud, I'll close the window. But like I said, bonjour and hello everybody. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about around the history of residential schools, and this is from a larger curriculum that I present to educators and to businesses across the country around just a quick sort of primer on residential schools. And then we'll lead us into some of the discussions that we'll have with Dr. Fontaine, as well as, around the issue of intergenerational harm. And Nicole, of course, will participate. And, and I'm not sure if Roy is coming in as well, but certainly we can talk a little bit. I mean, we're all impacted by residential schools in different ways. And so there's many stories to tell, and many stories that are very important, and many stories that Canadians are not hearing, have never heard before, and perhaps are triggered by perhaps our hearing for the very first time. So one of the most important things around residential school stories is just to take good care of yourself, and to know that those feelings that you're feeling, sometimes they're feelings of sadness, sometimes they're feelings of anger, sometimes they're feelings like, why have I never heard this before? Maybe it's a feeling of confusion. Take care of yourself. All of those feelings are legitimate feelings. It's okay to have those feelings, and it's certainly not possible for all of us to support each other through an online link, but that we just be kind with yourself and whatever way that operates for today. So I'm going to share my screen just for a moment here, and just so that we can talk a little bit about residential schools. And like I said, this is from a much larger presentation that I have, but I only have a few minutes to do this, a very quick presentation. Residential schools come out of a misunderstanding, a bastardization, an inappropriate step that the government took with partnering with the churches to create schooling, what they said to be the fulfillment of treaty responsibilities in what's called the numbered treaties, but also some of the pre-Confederation treaties. Many people, Indigenous peoples, were seeking schooling in the same way that it was said during Treaty 3 that we would teach each other's children, that Indigenous children would go and learn from non-Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous non-Indigenous peoples would send their children to Indigenous people so that we would learn about one another. And the mutated idea of that, or the offensive idea, was that it was only to go one way, and that Indigenous children were to be sent to non-Indigenous schooling to learn civilization, Christianization, and so on. And so by the end of the 19th century, there's around residential, there's what we see as the modern residential school period. And at the same time, there is this massive situation involving starvation in mostly central Canada, because cities were popping up. And so there was this issue around starvation for many communities. And so the issue around feeding schooling and residential schooling came to be something that the government saw as the attempts to both take children and to, sorry, my cat is going through a process over here, sorry about that. And that residential schools became this tool of colonization and assimilation. Or as Minister of Indian Affairs at the time, Deputy Minister Duncan Campbell Scott would say, our object is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. And so residential schools was the primary method to try to turn children. And I think the metaphor of what my father often says is the ugly duckling story is a good way to think about it. We are geese. We were tried, there was an attempt to turn us into ducks, teach us to walk like a duck, talk like a duck, act like a duck. But you can never, in the duck world, succeed when you are a goose. So the entire world is built on the idea of ducks, and therefore we will never succeed, no matter how many times we quack like a duck, talk like a duck, act like a duck. And that's how Indigenous children were treated, in that they were hammered time and time again with the notion that to be Indigenous is inappropriate, is to be uncivilized, it is to be inferior. And so by the 1920s, children are forced to attend, and that the provinces have a role to play in many of this, because the provinces, while under the British North America Act, had the obligation or the responsibility over education, we of course stayed with the federal department because of our treaties. But the provinces were encouraging the creation of these residential schools, that they were building schools, ironically, in certain cultural groups like Mennonites, for example, were taking control of their own schools, but not for Indigenous peoples. That was put with the federal department in partnership with the churches. And when Indigenous people started to resist and to not send their children, including my grandfather. My grandfather was physically and sexually abused in Fort Alex School, and my family just simply withdrew them from school and went away. In fact, enfranchised themselves as a result. Gave up their Indian status. The legal and guardianship by 1933 was forced upon Indigenous parents, First Nations parents, so that if you tried to not send your children to school, you could be jailed. And then most importantly, you would give up your children. And that's the initial, what I often say is the residential school system is the beginning of the child welfare system, because it's the forced removal of children into systems. And one other thing that I'll add into residential schools is there's some really remarkable research coming out from Anne Lindsay and Carly Saposnak. I wrote about this in a column recently. The life within the schools was very hard for children. And so oftentimes they were not going to school at all. They weren't going to classes at all. They were working 15 hours a day, which would have been tantamount to slavery. And so we can see on this map here the different boarding schools that were throughout the country. There were 1,300 day and industrial schools, which are often not talked about. But these are schools, sometimes they would include residential school elements within them, but they wouldn't be recognized as a residential school. So there's only 133 residential schools, full-time residential schools, but there are part-time residential schools with day schools under the settlement agreement that have not been recognized, under the settlement agreement. So there's a day school negotiation, or day school compensation package, which came much later than the TRC. About 150,000 children attended residential schools. Like I said before, that's only in the boarding school system. The day schoolers, of course, a much larger group from all the way up into the 1990s. Residential schools were chronically underfunded. Churches would often take the money that they were offered to run the schools and then increase their missionization efforts. And in that formula, the children did not get adequate food, adequate sanitation, adequate health environments. And so they would often have to fundraise for their own school. Like I told you before, the word slavery is used very intentionally when I describe that, because my grandmother, my non-native grandmother, my French grandmother in the Pas used to tell stories to me about seeing the residential school children go door to door to sell the things that they had been making in the school for essentially their own servitude. And so these were places that were under-resourced, often full of disease, hunger, overcrowding, and repair. And the odds of dying in school were higher than participating even in world wars. And so by the 1950s, there's a law passed to say children have to attend class. Like, that's amazing that the first 60 years of the system, 70 years of the system, you didn't have to attend class. So many schools didn't even offer class. They just made them work in the farm all day, made them sew all day. And so these schools would only go to grade 9 anyways, as if many children went that far anyways. It's very well documented and perhaps most talked about how children were not allowed to speak the language, kept away from their home for a long period of time. In the case of many children, they were allowed to come home for a week, maybe a year, maybe a week at Christmas or a day at Christmas, and something along that line. At the well-known Kamloops School, Father O'Grady wrote a letter to his First Nations parents to say, you could have them for 2 weeks, but you must pay for them to come home and to be returned. And if they are late, you'll never see them again. And this is a person who later has been, schools have been named after, program at UBC has been named after, buildings have been named after, which tells you that those who succeeded in residential schools to harm Indigenous peoples the most were the most revered. The document is physical sexual abuse. We were no doubt going to talk about some of those elements within schools. My grandfather experienced that firsthand, which then resonated through our family. We'll talk about that in a minute. But, I used to have a person who would follow me around the country, and my other family members and many of us who are working in this area. And he would harass us, and he would constantly, and there's many people like this, people who deny the impacts of residential schools and say, oh, why don't you tell the good story? Okay, so here I am. I'm going to tell you the good story of residential school. Are you ready? People learned a skill. They might have learned to play hockey. They might have learned how to play the piano. They might have learned how to sew. They might have learned some farming techniques. None of that replaced parents. None of that replaced language. Not 1 second of hockey playing ever replaced your time in community. And so frankly, the idea that there's anything good that came out of residential schools is just an absolute denial of where the fact is that people were forced to attend, to be removed from their community, and they suffered an immense amount of trauma over the lack of having parents, oftentimes physical sexual abuse, and then at the same time, an enduring legacy that would impact them for the rest of their life. The amazing thing is that survivors came out of those schools and intending to say this is never going to happen elsewhere. We're going to start a resistance movement. In the 1960s, when First Nations or peoples are allowed to leave the reserve, very first time in history as First Nations people, think about that for a moment, that we were not allowed to leave our communities until the 1960s. And then on top of that, then when we're moving into cities, into towns, we begin to form and discuss. Basil Johnson talks a lot about that, about how First Nations began to talk to one another and create resistance movements. And then at the Blue Quill schools, survivors took over the school itself, the very school that they had attended, and began to organize that. They began to talk about intergenerational impacts, which is things we're about to talk about in just a minute. Erin Hansen, sorry about that. Erin Hansen is documented that well, as many other, including Dr. Fontaine's great aunt, Roz Young-Ing, talks about intergenerational effects from residential schools, which talks about things like suicide and violence and traumas, addictions, which have all been come out of the impacts around the schools. And I myself, as a Indigenous man, I'm going to talk a little bit about that during the panel. It certainly has impacted me in different ways, but probably the most marked ways is that growing up with a really negative sense of identity, of misunderstanding, never having those initiation rites, never having those positive relationships with other men, because men are often encouraged to go away from home, and then the overburdening of that on Indigenous women, which often puts Indigenous women in very difficult circumstances where they are doing the most amount of work in communities. As a result, all of those things are intergenerational effects. In the 1990s, and Dr. Fontaine was a big part of this, the Residential School Settlement Agreement, which created the TRC, is a case that was started with Phil Fontaine in 1990. For the very first time, anyone talking about sexual abuse, physical abuse, which happened in the schools, and the fact that Canada was absolutely blown away by that story. Many people denied that it happened, and that it began a conversation throughout the 1980s. Eventually, the court case, which took the federal government and the churches to court. As a result, in 2006, finally, there's a residential school settlement agreement, which creates the TRC, a base payment, compensation through the process of an independent assessment process, and then other things like a healing initiative, and then eventually the Truth and Reconciliation, or the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is located at the University of Manitoba, which researches residential schools. So what I've done there is I've given you a very brief and very sort of kernel's view of what the issue of residential schools are. And certainly it is not the total story. It's the most I could do in 10 minutes. And so I'm sure I can see in the chat here some wonderful information that you can also supplement some of my presentation there, but I'll hand it back to Nicole so that we can get started with some of the panel.
Thank you so much, Niigaan. I thoroughly enjoy hearing you speak, and coming from such a very grounded and extremely, through your personal experiences. And I just, it's really great. Thank you for sharing the slides. And we will get to some of the Q&A in about an hour after we are done this portion with the panelists. And we look forward to, of course, answering your questions, and you can put them into, of course, the Zoom chat. The next speaker on the panel I wanted to introduce is Lorena, and Lorena Fontaine. And I just want to let Lorena know that my daughter's name is Sikwan as well. It's such a beautiful name, and in our Cree language, it means spring. So she is Anishinaabe and a member of the Saugeen First Nation in Manitoba. She is an Indigenous academic lead, co-director of a new Indigenous languages program, an associate professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Winnipeg. Her research includes linguicide, that you're going to have to get the right, and I'm so sorry.
Get it right.
Yes. Okay. The legacy of residential schools and Indigenous language rights in Canada. Dr. Fontaine has taught for the First Nations University of Canada and the School of Public Policy graduate programs at Queen's University. She has spoken nationally and internationally and has authored articles on residential school issues and Indigenous language rights in Canada. Please welcome Lorena, Dr. Fontaine. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, for that introduction. So I guess what I'll start talking about is my recent work on residential schools, which revolves around loss of language and culture. So I have been an advocate for Indigenous language rights for a number of years, but I've also been working on digital stories since 2010 on the intergenerational legacy of residential schools. And I just want to begin by maybe stepping back from the work to just talk about how I became involved in this. I didn't know about residential schools until the 1990s. I had heard the word before, but I had no idea that Canada had been involved in this history. It was in the early 1990s. I was attending a conference with my mother, who started talking about the abuse she experienced in the schools. And I just about fell off my chair because I didn't know about the schools. I didn't know that she had attended one. I had no idea that she had been abused. And when we got in the car, I realized, or I intuitively knew not to ask questions. And ever since that period, I have been an active learner to find out about what happened in the schools. And I still don't know the whole history, but I certainly know a lot more than I did at that point. And what that said to me was that the discussions around residential schools was very much kept to survivors. They hadn't talked about the schools to their children, their families. And it was really, as Niigaan had mentioned in the presentation, when Phil Fontaine started talking about the abuse, where it opened up the doorways for families to start talking about the schools. And I think we're still very much on that journey. I started working on residential school claims in 2003. And from that experience, I came to know that I had been impacted by my parents' and my grandparents' experiences. So my grandparents on both sides of my family attended residential schools, as well as my parents. And I knew from talking to survivors on those claims that I had been similarly impacted. You know, they had talked about the legacy, the impact on their children and their grandchildren. And I could see the impact on my life as well. Around 2010, there really hadn't been any discussions about the intergenerational legacy of the schools. So on my generation, the descendants of residential school survivors, and there were a number of women health researchers that were looking at the legacy of the residential schools. And it was really women at that time that noted that there were effects transmitted through families, and that it was starting to accumulate in a cluster of health issues. And I was very honored to be asked to participate in a research project that looked at the daughters of First Nations women who had attended residential schools. And I was not a researcher. I was being researched at that time, but I was looking for any opportunity to connect with others that had been impacted by the schools. So from that research project, we have worked with over 30 Indigenous peoples on telling their stories. And I can say that the impact is quite extensive, but The one project that had the most impact on me when we were talking about the impact on mothering, there were 7 of us that were being researched at that time. And we all fold our towels the same way. We all woke up Saturday mornings with this urge to clean. And in fact, our mothers enforced cleaning Saturday mornings. We all make our beds the same way. We all talked about the smell of pine sol in the morning. And what we were actually talking about was how our mothers were treated in the schools, how they lived their days, cleaning, folding, making beds, that we realized at that time that we all had been similarly impacted in just our day-to-day activities. But I can tell you that that was the first time that anybody had asked us what it was like to be parented by residential school survivors. Some of us knew that we had been negatively impacted, and there were a couple of women who had never really thought the way that we were living our life was actually attributed to the residential schools. So I could talk on and on about this this research project, but what I can say is that these schools have severely impacted the raising of children in this generation, and it continues. We can see it in the child welfare system. We have more kids in school. We have more kids in the child welfare system than the height of the residential schools. And it's really the impact on parenting, mothering that has resulted in these horrific statistics that are still affecting our children's lives. Nicole, I don't know if you want me to keep going on about the project. Okay. So when we were sitting together, talking about the impact on us as women whose mothers who had attended the residential schools, all of us talked about the fact that our mothers never hugged us. We were never told by our mothers that they loved us. But we know that they did love us and they do love us. But that is one of the major impacts, is that children were not shown love in these schools. So when they became parents, it was very hard for them to show love. Some of them didn't know how. But on the flip side of that is our mothers were very resilient, very determined women, very determined to pass on what they knew culturally to us, even if it was in a way that didn't say that they were passing on the culture. They did it in a number of ways. They all encouraged us to go and get an education. All of us had attended university. We all worked very hard in our educational careers, and I attribute that to having very strong mothers that ironically valued education, even though they had horrific experiences in their educational, in schools. They all wanted us to become educated so that we could look after our families. I also think that when we look across the country, that the schools, I think one of the major impacts is that they disconnected us emotionally, physically, culturally, from our communities, our families, our mothers, our aunties, and our uncles, as well as the land. And this has all impacted our ability to raise our children in a holistic way, to pass on the language, to pass on the cultural identity, to develop relationships with our elders. The residential schools disconnected us from all the things that make us Indigenous peoples. And we created digital stories based on some of our own personal experiences from that research project. And we went across the country and we shared our stories with anyone in the north or in the south, in schools. We traveled outside of Canada. And the stories are really profound in a way that we talk about our everyday experiences of raising our children, the fact that we had to break down those barriers of being able to hug our children, to tell them that we love them, and to be determined to reclaim our cultural identity and our language. And I attribute that resiliency from our mothers that had gone through the schools. My mother was 3 years old when she was removed from our community. And she stayed in the school until she was 16. And she was physically abused for speaking our language in the school. And it was I can just imagine it must have been such a very confusing, horrible time in her life, because my grandparents only spoke Cree. And so she would come home after being told she couldn't speak the language and she was physically punished, back into our community where my grandparents enforced Cree. They could only speak Cree in the home. And I think what I attribute out of that is that my grandparents really held the language so dear, and passed on the importance of maintaining the language and culture by example. So when I would go back home into our community, my grandparents refused to speak English. And so what that said to me when I started uncovering some of the legacy of the schools and how it impacted my life, I remember them speaking Cree. And I remembered that they held the language dear to our family. And I realized that what they were telling us was that our language and culture is so integral to who we are as Indigenous people, that I went to school and I studied law and have been a language advocate ever since. So we can see that the trickling legacy of the schools have had tremendous harm to our people, to our children. We still see the legacy on the streets. People still struggle. But I am a firm believer that our grandparents our elders that kept the language and culture alive, left us with something to cling on to. And it's something that not only Indigenous people need to hold dear and to advocate for, but it's also Canadians that need to know this history, need to hear stories from residential school survivors and their children, but also need to stand with us when we advocate for linguistic rights for Indigenous people, when we advocate for immersion programs for our schools so that they can learn their ancestral language. We still need advocates, non-Indigenous advocates, to stand with us, to be our allies, to ensure that our language and culture survives, that our children have a good grounding in who they are. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. And I would just like to thank the Canadian Race Relations for this webinar. It's so important for us to talk about these stories and these legacies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fontaine. I absolutely think that the discussions that we're having today and specifically on mothering, motherhood, our matriarchs that have gone before us, and maintain language, identity, our cultural ways of being and knowing is extremely important. My mother speaks fluent Cree, and I'm very happy that she managed to do so. And so I don't fluently speak. I understand to hear it, and I can speak all the command words, of course. And that goes back to perhaps maybe some of your research of, eat, sleep, clean, go play, everything that's a command. And so I can speak that, and my daughter understands that, and she can speak it as well. But on the flip side of that, she understands the loving words, like kisagit, and like I love you. Even by naming her Sikwan, it was getting people, Canadians and anyone else, to speak Cree by saying her name. So that to me was like a way of, bringing back language, and also in my own way, looking at ways of trying to, learn my language. So anyways, I thank you so much. It's so insightful, some of the work that you're doing. And again, for the questions that you have for our panelists, we are going to go into those questions in the next 20 minutes or so. I wanted to ensure that we have enough time to get to those questions. And this is such an important discussion that we're having here. I have a few questions that we put together and for the program, and I wanted to ensure that we, get to some of the discussions. But so maybe I'll stick with Dr. Fontaine here. So how has the residential school shaped mothering and the role of matriarchs within our communities? You've shared a bit about that, of course, but I think the question that I think is really, is important is, what can we do as mothers, matriarchs, to ensure future generations have ancestral knowledge, to ensure that we're continuing on a path of, repatriating, essentially getting back our language, our ceremonial tools, our ways of, connecting with our Mother Earth. There's so much that can be done. So maybe you can share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'll just talk from personal experience here. So my mother is a residential school survivor, came out of the schools very much ashamed of being Cree and speaking the language. And it was interesting because when I was a child, she went searching for spirituality in her life and we were going to churches. We went to Anglican churches, we went to Catholic churches. I remember we went to some alternative churches, and spirituality was really important to her. And she was trying to find a way to integrate that in how she mothered us. So she brought us to that. It wasn't until the 80s that she found our ceremonies. She started attending Sundance ceremonies. She started attending Medewan ceremonies. And she brought my brother and sister and I along with her. My sister became a Sundancer. My brother and I became helpers. And what she was doing there was reclaiming our spirituality by bringing us. So I think it's really key that families find that path to finding spirituality back into their life, whether it's at ceremonies, whether it's, listening to stories, whether it's, working with other women and talking about these things. And because of my mom's ability to reclaim, those ceremonies in our life, I was able to pass that on to my daughter. So I made sure that when I became pregnant with her, I went looking for a way to bring her into this world that followed our traditional ways. So I made the decision that I wanted to have her at home. I wanted her to be born in our community. I wanted my aunties to be around her, my mother. And I found 2 Aboriginal midwives that were willing to go into my community, and they traveled with me while I was pregnant. Or sorry, they didn't travel with me while I was pregnant. They traveled to me while I was pregnant. And, you know, they did the prenatal classes. And then they actually traveled to the PA, where I'm from on my mother's side. And for 2 weeks before my daughter was born, they sat.
I feel like we lost the sound there for Lorena. Did something happen with? Yeah, I've lost my sound.
Yeah, I've also lost my sound as well. Dr. Fontaine, can you hear us?
I can't hear her either.
I don't know if she can hear us either.
Something's happened there where she's lost her sound. No, we can't hear you. Yeah. Oh, we can't hear you. No, I can read your lips though. Yeah.
Okay.
For some reason, we've lost Lorena's sound. So
Lorena, if you could hear us, we
Maybe-
will. Oh,
if she logged out and came back in, maybe that might be the best move.
can somebody inbox her? Sharon, you're assisting with the technical aspect. Maybe perhaps you can help with this. And then we can, yeah, she's going to have to log out. And
Or
while
she could
we're,
switch her microphone. Might be that little arrow just above the mute button there, Lorena? There is a little button right here in the left-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner. Okay, there she goes. She logged out. Okay.
okay. So we should come back to her, but for now, do you think it'd be appropriate, Dr. Sinclair, to ask you a question and then come back to her?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Actually, there's a whole bunch of things that I want to talk about. Roy has posted some really great stuff in terms of, but I mean, if you want to ask your question first, I'm going to address what Roy was talking about just a minute ago, and certainly Roy can come in and clarify what he was saying. But I mean, do you want to do your question? Do you want me to?
I was going to say you can go ahead, because Roy, I was going to also ask if he wanted to come in and, you know, give his thoughts as well. So I will give the floor to you. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is a really good spot to bring Roy back in, just because Roy is a good source for being able to talk a little bit about some of the things that he posted in the chat. Lots of people ask the question. Let's check. Lorena, is your sound working? Lorena, is your sound working? Oh, so I don't know if she hears me at all now. So the people ask me, what did Canadians know? How come nobody stepped out and was outraged by this? The Canadian government was fully aware what was happening in residential schools, the sexual, physical abuse. They were participating openly, as Dr. Ian Mosby has pointed out, in health experiments on the children. So on things like what they were doing is they knew children were starving. In the health experiments that Dr. Ian Mosby had identified, they gave some children vitamins to try to test their teeth, to say what would be the impact of teeth or nutritional experiments on children. And so Dr. Mosby had identified that in some research. But what Roy has pointed out, and I'll invite Roy to talk, what did you post in the chat there, Roy, that people can go take a look at?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sinclair. You know, I was just kind of pointing out that, you know, as you mentioned, in the course of this history, the Canadian government knew what was going on. It was simply part of their mandate around assimilation. And when people ask the question, well, why didn't Canadians stand up against this? It's, and I just kind of posted that there was a lot of propaganda and euphemistic language that was used to cover up a lot of those government policies. And when we see it in the video that I posted, there was a lot of that same propaganda used in Canada that we've seen used across the globe in a number of different situations. And so when you think of the language, especially around protection as a euphemism, especially within the Indian Act, we will protect your children from settlement, we'll protect them from your communities. This notion of protection became a euphemism as a word in a way to take children away into the schools under this type of language. So that language was being relayed to Canadian citizens that we're protecting Indigenous children from, for settlement and assimilation into our country. And that language became very damaging. And that's what I just wanted to add, was that there was a lot of propaganda in so many different forms of media. And when we talk about reconciliation, the media, and maybe Nicole, you can add on this as well, plays a large role in how it produces and provides information. And that's kind of where I was going with that, Dr. Sinclair.
Yeah, Dr. Cindy Blackstock has made a career out of talking about Peter Bryce, who was a doctor who was an investigator into residential schools in the early 19th century. And what he had done is provided reports to the federal government saying two important things. Children were dying rapidly in the schools, and the schools were highly unsafe, which was going to result in more harm to children. And that report was provided, and Dr. Bryce was widely ridiculed. He was cast off. He was punished for having reported that information, which tells you two things: that the government had an intention to cover it up, and second was to punish anyone who did talk about what was happening in residential schools, and then to tell a different story to everyday Canadians. My grandmother certainly knew that there was a residential school, but she thought it was normal. She thought it was something good. She thought, oh, look at these children going door to door selling their things. They must be very proud of them. And so my grandmother, who certainly wouldn't have come out and marched, or even hired a lawyer, or fought the schools, she in her everyday life thought this was a normal process. And so for many Canadians, waking up in the 1990s when Phil Fontaine first talked about his physical sexual abuse, they denied it. They said, oh, you must be a bad apple. Or, oh, if it's true, maybe he's looking to get some money, or maybe he's looking to get some attention. The fact is that it happened en masse. It was a systemic issue. And what that tells you, if Peter Bryce, if Dr. Ian Mosby talks about medical experiments, if the fact the Canadian government was covering it up, it tells you two things: that there was neglect, open neglect in the schools. And if there perhaps were some bureaucrats, some Canadians, maybe people who worked at the schools who just simply turned another way, that's a crime called neglect. If you bring a child into an unsafe situation and then you just leave them in it, that is a crime under the criminal code called neglect. The second thing, if they witnessed harm and they did nothing about it, that's a crime of might as well have you pulled the trigger yourself. Because if you witness crime and you do nothing to assist the person, then you are culpable in it. So what does that tell you? The Canadian government and the churches perpetrated crimes. They were fully aware of them. And therefore, there is no question about the physical intent of harm of residential schools. And the argument often around genocide was there a mental intent? Oh, they meant well. You'll hear that with premiers. Premier Brian Pallister, a Minister of Indigenous Affairs of Manitoba here in Manitoba, said, Alan Lajmodi said, oh, residential schools they meant well, just a few bad apples kind of thing. No, absolutely not. It is unequivocally, unquestionably, absolutely genocide, because there is a mental intent, and the covering up of graves, the idea that they knew the harm that was going on and they simply ignored it. And lastly, that there was an awareness that children were dying in the schools simply by looking at the records, and then nobody did anything to stop it. In the Canadian government, in the churches, that means both of them were culpable in genocide, period. There is no question at all. This was a genocide. And I don't know if we can let Lorena back in, because does your microphone work again? Or
I'm back.
Oh, you're
Wonderful.
You were telling this beautiful story about the birth of your child, and then just boom, silence. So
Yeah, maybe the spirits out there were just wanting a moment of silence.
They wanted to hear from Roy. That's what they wanted to do. I'm sure people would want to hear the end of that story there. When you were cut off was when you said that the midwives came to the community.
Okay. Yeah, so the midwives ended up coming to the community to help me birth my daughter. And during this time, I went around talking to women elders in the community to find out what do we do when we birth children? And their eyes lit up because it was the first time somebody had asked them that. And I was told that my daughter would be the first child born in the community in over 50 years. And our ceremonies and our birthing practices were outlawed. And we still had a lot of midwives in our community that knew about birthing. So it was I was so grateful for that time with them because we talked about birthing. They told my mother and my aunts and I what to do when my daughter started coming. We had a sweat lodge ceremony. I was fed our traditional foods. When she was born, my mother caught her and started speaking Cree to her. We bathed her in cedar water. We put the cedar water around the house to make sure she was connected to the earth. We buried her placenta and umbilical cord into the ground so that she'd always be connected to our territory, and have continued to raise her with a very strong understanding that she is a strong Cree Anishinaabe woman, young woman. She was given her spirit name at the age of 6 weeks. We've always taken her to ceremonies. She had her coming of age ceremony, which is a big celebration for young women, when they're going through their change of life. And she was filled with women who loved her. All these ceremonies that I'm talking about are things that were denied to us when our mothers, our granddaughters, our great grandmothers, and our grandmothers were put into these schools, and were not able to pass these teachings on. And Nicole, you asked how we reclaim that. Well, it's by doing what I did. It's going back to our elders and asking them for this knowledge. But it shouldn't be just in our communities that we're talking about these things. We need to be putting these into the educational system. Our kids should be learning this in school. Our kids should be learning this in our communities. Our kids should be learning this at home. Kids should be coming out of K to 12 with a strong understanding of their language, their cultural identity, because we were just talking about genocide. It still continues in our educational system because our children are not coming out of the educational system knowing their language and knowing their identity. So I'm of the view that the damage of the schools is still continuing in our educational systems today. Our mothers also raised not only young women, but also men, young boys. They had sons that have missed out on those ceremonies and those ways to ground our children in their identity. I'm currently at a workshop with about 150 language advocates. We're trying to figure out how we can start teaching our language in the K to 12 system, in universities, in our communities, and they're all struggling financially. We know how to teach kids language. We have immersion programs in French and English in this country, And we should be supporting our language teachers right now that desperately want to make sure that our children learn their language and their cultural identity in schools. So that's what I was going to share when I was cut off. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fontaine. I definitely can agree that more Canadians and everyone should learn about, and it should be standard right across the country, because I know that, of course, each individual province, they come up with their own curriculum. And in the case of in Alberta, completely have taken away a lot of curriculum that should have been, that was, over 5-10 years, there was a lot of Indigenous people that worked on that. And for it to be, sidelined during this past, year and a half, maybe 2 years since our current government got in, I just think that it's important that there should be, curriculum that is standard for each province right across this country to learn about what occurred. And I just want to add too that with my daughter, I had raised her, knowing a lot of the customs and understanding. But the other side to that is, her on her dad's side, she comes from where St. Anne's is and Fort Albany First Nation, and her Mushum is Edmatatuabin. And so, understanding that and hearing those stories when he first released his book, Up Ghost River, about 7 years ago, she understood, that there was a electrocution chair. And this was at 9 years old. And to understand that and to know the history, the true history of what occurred at that age, for her was obviously an eye-opener. For me, helping her to sort of have that balance between this happened and this is really awful and we're taking steps to regain and reclaim our ways of being, and not to get to there needs to be a delicate balance, is what we're told by many elders and people in our lives. And I think that definitely struck a chord with me. So thank you. I know we have the next 10 minutes or so to wrap up, and then we'll go into the questions. And I look forward to getting to some of them, of course. So in terms of some of the discussions that are occurring here, I wanted to invite in back into the discussion, into the fold, Niigaan, if you have some words for wrapping up and what we were discussing. And I know that there's been a lot of in the chat, so we will get to some of that as well. But I just want to give you the floor.
Yeah, just trying to figure out, I've posted 2 articles that I've written for the Winnipeg Free Press. The first one is the piece on the research on that I mentioned before around the work that students were doing in school as fulfilling the criteria of slavery and fulfilling the definition of slavery, particularly until the 1950s. And so it's wonderful research. I think that it's working now. And the second is a piece that's some research that I've done with a woman who is a wonderful woman. She's senior, she's Canadian, lives in Winnipeg here. And she was a flight attendant who worked on what was, I think it was called Canadian North in those days, the airline. And they were hired to fly children, Inuit children, from northern routes, northern locations to residential schools. And these children, of course, were highly traumatized. It's a very difficult story to read. So trigger warning for those who are reading that story. But it's a very difficult story that she didn't realize that she participated in the system. So she's a typical Canadian. She's somebody who had no idea, but then witnessed a little bit of the system, had no idea that she was a part of this massive atrocity that was taking place. And she participated because she was trying to make a living. She's just trying to do her job properly, and as a flight attendant. And so she did the best that she could. And she tells this very emotional story of wanting to give the children cookies. Even though they were crying, they were getting quite sick on the plane. They were all alone. They had no no adult supervision, and they were being taken to residential schools. They're a very difficult story. But that's a typical kind of thing that we can talk about when it comes to trauma, because everybody is traumatized by residential school. We have suffered the most as those most directly impacted. I mean, my father did not attend, but my grandfather did. And so my grandfather's legacy of the harm that he perpetrated through my family lives in my life. I struggle with lots of different things, particularly around intimacy. I struggle a lot with feelings of identity, the same things that happened to my grandfather. My grandfather was a highly abusive man, and he beat my father, hurt my father very deeply. And then as a result, my father, in many ways, couldn't parent me. And I had difficulty parenting as well. I've also had a lot of difficulty with my own feelings of fear and neglect, and I run a lot, and I do a lot of situations of avoidance and self-sabotage. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things that have come out of my grandfather's legacy. And it's an everyday struggle for all of us as Indigenous peoples to not, what my therapist says, is just drive in the ditch, to try to just keep it steady. Calmness is the one thing that was taken away from us, stability, love, in those schools. And so it's difficult for many of us in our lives today as intergenerational survivors to have stability. Like, stability is an abnormality for many of us. And so that's actually very scary. And so, like, we're more comfortable with instability, and that, or what my therapist says, drive in the ditch, because you keep wanting to drive in the ditch all the time. And it's because I'm comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with trauma more than I'm comfortable with senses of, like what they used to do with Phil as an example, or a wonderful survivor named Theodore Fontaine, who wrote some wonderful books. You can check out his books on, he was moved from school to school and was labeled a problem. And therefore his experience was of constant moving, a constant never being told you're good enough, constantly being told you're a problem. And so those are the kinds of experiences that we have lived with today. And Canadians, on the same hand, I would say, it's not the other hand, it's the same hand. Canadians never witnessed. If they did witness the schools, they often couldn't do anything about it. And if they did witness those things, they may have had things that they don't want to talk about, that they too witnessed those things, because we know that with trauma, sometimes it's the witnesses of the trauma who also experience that harm because they can't help. If Canadians didn't know about it and are only finding out here in 2021 what's happened, then they might ask the question, well, what else wasn't I told? Those teachers who I trusted growing up never told me. My parents, why is it that I am only hearing this story now? And I only thought of Canada as this maple syrupy sweet place. It's actually a place of blood. It's a place of murders. It's a place of land theft. It's a place where children were taken by the state and put into harmful situations. And how am I supposed to stand for the flag now? How am I supposed to stand for O Canada? How am I supposed to live in this place that I thought was this multicultural, idyllic, beautiful, rose-colored place, when it is really a place that is full of a lot of violence? Well, what I say to Canadians is, you have to figure out a way to have both those, because it's not that Canada didn't do some important things. Of course it did. Romeo Dallaire in Rwanda, for example, that's produced out of a very Canadian story. But at the same time, it also perpetrated incredible harms and genocide, and continues to do so today, as Dr. Fontaine's pointed out, in the school system. So therefore, you have to figure out a way to do what we do every day, which is to live in this world where we are so proud to be Indigenous, but we have had these things that have happened to us that we're trying to figure out and carry. And I think for Canadians, it's the job of Canadians to not drive in the ditch, not go to a place in which you deny it any further, not a place in which you are comfortable with violence happening in Attawapiskat or on a pipeline route where Indigenous peoples are standing up kindly and peacefully on their own territories, or that we support premiers who say horrendously racist things. I'm so proud that in Manitoba here, Brian Pallister, who is the premier, was removed not because he bungled the pandemic, not because he closed ERs, although he should have been removed for those things. He was removed by his own party, the Conservative Party. When would that happen? The Conservative Party of Manitoba, because of the racist things he said about Indigenous peoples. That's everyday Manitobans who are saying that we are not going to tolerate this idea of Canadian superiority and Indigenous inferiority that was birthed in the residential school legacies any further. And Canada's got a long way before reconciliation is even a conversation. But you can take solace in knowing that Canadians, particularly in communities where Indigenous peoples are a significant amount, like in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Northwestern Ontario, that everyday Canadians are stepping up for probably the first time in history, putting on an orange shirt, standing with us, supporting with us. There's many more Canadians yet to have to join this journey. Many, many more. And let me tell you that the other day I heard New Brunswick banning territorial acknowledgements or the word unceded. I mean, New Brunswick's stolen everybody. So New Brunswick better to return some stolen land. Never mind all the stolen land here in Manitoba and everywhere in this country. In Montreal, they do a territorial acknowledgement and the minister comes out and goes, yeah, that was just a mistake. You know, like we have lots of Canadians full holding on so tightly. We have Jean Chrétien who's coming out and going, yeah, residential schools weren't that bad. They were kind of like when I went to boarding school. The very highest office, the highest person in this country can be the most ignorant. And we still live in a country where we hold people like that up. The fact is that we have a long way to go, but the more that we can try to look at one another and say, let's talk about this legacy, let's figure out a way to be able to understand it both from Indigenous peoples and from Canadian peoples, have a conversation around reconciliation. Let's commit to the calls to action from the TRC, the 94 calls to action. That means we deal with the history, but we also build all the different institutions. That's call to action 43 through 94. That means new museums, new policies. We adopt Indigenous rights within the Constitution. We create a true system where Indigenous peoples in media, in youth groups, in Parliament, that we all train each other and we talk about it. We promise to never create problems or systems like this again. And then we try to move together into the future. And maybe 150 years from now, we might be able to look at each other and see that each other as partners in confederation, not just one side being deemed as superior and one side being deemed as inferior or problems, and then we could be partners. Treaty people, that would be actually what treaty people would be all about. So miigwech, and as we head into the question, I hope that was a sort of adequate way to sum it up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinclair. We will go into some of the questions because we are heading into this time where we are going to need some ample time to get into the questions. So one of the questions that we have, this person, anonymous, I recognize the value of the TRC, but why can't individuals still be held accountable instead of hiding behind it? Anonymity, autonomy, I should say. Maybe someone, either Dr. Sinclair or Dr. Fontaine, want to take a jab at that.
So I just have a clarification. So who are they wanting to be held accountable? Is it Canada or individuals that have done harm in the schools, or maybe both?
It wasn't stated, but I would think that the discussions that have been held so far that I've been reading in the media is that there are people alive that essentially have committed these harms, and why aren't they being brought before, courts and justice occurring while they're still alive, essentially. So why isn't that happening?
Well, I think one way to answer that question is that we had over 10,000 residential school claims from 2003 until the settlement agreement. And those were individual claims against the federal government and the churches that survivors, all those 10,000 claims were amalgamated into one class action suit. And as a result, we have the settlement agreement. There are, those didn't involve individual people, although there have been some court claims against individual perpetrators in the schools. And there have been some court cases where people have been, fined for those harms. But you're right, there hasn't been individual claims against, perpetrators in the schools. And it might be partially because of the settlement agreement that there were court claims initiated and there was compensation paid out. But I think even as we move, we talk about the burial grounds that are being uncovered now. What happened to those children? Who harmed them? Why didn't we know about their burials? Why didn't who harmed them? And I am sure that there are still a number of people that are alive that could tell us what happened to those children. Maybe there is still more claims to be filed that survivors haven't initiated yet. But I also think that we as a country have to support those individuals, that when they do file claims, that they're supported. I was really surprised when a very close relative of mine who had been involved in the settlement agreement, when the graves started coming up in the media, he told me, he said, finally, people believe us how bad it was. I think that there is still a lot of survivors that feel like they wouldn't be believed if they came with some of these stories. So I think the more that we have conversations uncovering the truth about what individuals faced in the schools, the abuse, the murders, that there might be more claims that come in the future.
The one thing I want to just add, and this is a very uncomfortable conversation for many of us, but it is a conversation that certainly Dr. Fontaine and I have talked about, and other people have spoken about, and no doubt, I mean, one of the hardest things about talking about residential schools, and Basil Johnson, who of course was the great Anishinaabe storyteller, who I had some opportunities to spend some time with before he passed, he talked a lot about this, and it's very hard. It's very hard to talk about this, so I'll do my best that I can to keep it together. One of the hardest conversations to have about residential schools of who perpetrated harms was older children, and in many schools there were older boys, particularly, that would hurt the younger boys, and in some cases, because boys and girls were often separated. Not on all the cases, but there are some situations of boys harming girls. But one of the hardest conversations is hearing about boys who harm other boys. And what oftentimes older boys would learn that system from the priests and the nuns. And I think oftentimes when we think about the perpetrators, there are many people who are still alive, particularly in the North. We were going to have Levinia on today to talk a little bit about the schools in the North. You know, if we go up to the Northern, when the TRC held their Northern event, their national event, they remarked, and they wrote in the report, that it's remarkable that many of the survivors are my age or even younger. We have to remember that in some cases, residential schools closed in the 1990s. So there are people who are younger than me who are residential school survivors. And in the North, that's the norm. People who are my age and younger who are residential school survivors. And in many ways, I'm not going to call the current system in the North as a residential school, but it has many tenets. It's still often run by churches, still very far away from communities. There are still elements that go within those Northern schools. So it's easy to say priests and nuns. In many cases, we should find out who those individuals are. And while it is very difficult, find ways in which to hold them to account. But how do you hold account to someone who, as a young man, perpetrated harm against you, and you are now living in a community with, and years later, maybe you have figured out some way to see that person every day at the community mall, or to see them at the coffee shop, or to see them, your kids were raised together. Like, how do you reconcile that? In our communities, it's something that is there. It's something that is that's talked about and whispered about often. And it's something that the TRC, it was something that was very difficult to talk among the TRC, often didn't come up at a lot of the public hearings, but there are some cases of older people in schooling who had harmed some younger children. And this isn't by any ways the majority, but it is a story that I hear often. And you'd be surprised of the stories that I carry of individuals who today are working in universities, published books, people who are, for all intents and purposes, as celebrity as you can get as an Indigenous person. And while in residential school, perpetrated harms or have been accused of perpetrating harms against other survivors, and that it's difficult to talk about. And it's something that we talk about in our communities, but maybe it might not be something to be led out in the public. That it might be something that we are dealing in our own communities about. And that might be why you may not have heard of some of those conversations, because they happen. And there are ways in which our communities figure out ways to hold people to account, and also to try to reconcile that within a restorative justice model as opposed to a punitive model, which is what the jail system looks like.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinclair. Always just, yeah, some things to think about. And, you know, absolutely, those discussions that have occurred within community, and have heard as well, even with girls upon girls. And it's been a situation where it's created, you know, even within our communities, major problems within families, and hopefully we can heal from that and move forward. It's not such an easy task, but hopefully that
just tells you, though, it tells you how brutal the system was, how the children were taught to act in that way, how those things were just everyday occurrences, and there was an atmosphere created of violence that was infected everybody.
Absolutely agree. And I just want to make mention that Levinia Brown, I don't know if you're able to come in on the discussion, but I see your name is in the side here. And if you can't, then we will go to another question. But I just want to make sure that we gave her some time, and we, you know, wanted to, of course, bring her into the discussion. So just let us know if you are available for that. I have another question here, and I'm just looking at the chat. I know that under the Q&A, we are looking at, so what methods did you use to overcome the after effects of abuse in your family and community? So that's somewhat on point with what we were just discussing. And I know that, you know, our cultural ways of being, if the, you know, Dr. Fontaine, if you wanted to speak to that, if you wanted to answer that. I know there's many questions here in the Q&A, so we'll try to get to most of them. We have some time.
So how to deal with the after effects of the abuse in the
yeah,
school?
so what methods do you use to overcome the after effects? And I think some of it you discussed earlier with some of the ceremonial ways that your family and yourself had chosen.
Yeah, you know what, I think when I think about my own family, I don't think we do the best we can to heal from what happened in the schools. But I know that it's a life journey. I don't think we'll ever reach the point where we can say, yep, we're done healing. It's a lifelong process. And I think there's different layers there. You know, I had, my mother has gone through a lot of counseling, but she's also gone to our ceremonies that has really helped her. But I remember the one thing that had the most impact on my life. People talk about, you know, what was the point of the TRC? I know that a lot of people have been received a lot of education that were able to attend the school, to attend the events. There was also some private testimonies that were provided. My mom delivered one just to our family. And she told us that she was sorry for not being able to be there for us. And for me, that was a really pivotal moment in my healing journey, and I think also hers, to recognize that we had a really troubled relationship, and we needed to acknowledge that before we move on. And I think every family is going to have their own journey, their own story to tell of how they've dealt with it. And there are many, many families who haven't yet started that healing journey. We still have to have difficult conversations with each other. and conversations that some people may never be prepared to have. So we also have to be prepared for us to be able to do that healing sometimes on our own, without our communities or without our families. And there are some people who might not ever get there. And so I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because there are so many different ways that people have been harmed, and many different ways to deal with that harm.
I remember one, I'm part of a community patrol called the Mama Bear Clan, which walks in downtown Winnipeg in the North Point Douglas, poorest community in the country per capita. I remember walking up to this fire that had been made with a bunch of people sitting around minus 40-degree day here in Winnipeg. We do a lot of the work with tent cities, people who are without homes, people who are sleeping on the streets in tents and so on, and people who are struggling for food. And anyways, I remember walking up to this circle of people who were around a fire, and I was about 10 meters away, maybe 15, and I started hearing the fluent Ojibwe, and I was like what's like, I'm an okay, I can understand a lot when I've been, I've studied Ojibwe for quite a long time. I was like, fluent Ojibwe speakers. They're just chattering away in Ojibwe. There's like 10 people there, and they're all just talking in Ojibwe. They were all residential school survivors sleeping on the streets. And so what's that tell you? Two things. One is every day, like there's no end to this process of trying to figure out a way to live. Every day for me is a struggle. And I'm not going to lie in that some days are good and some days are not so good. I struggle every day with my own feelings of, and people often say, "Oh, Niigaan, you're successful, you're on TV, you have a PhD." Every day is a struggle, like to not implode or to not make bad choices. So it's like every day you try to make a better choice. And for our relatives who are going through some self-harming or struggles with addiction, or for one way or another, maybe haven't had the supports or opportunities that I've had. They're sleeping on the streets. And so our relatives who are sleeping on the streets, they're still finding community. Like notice that they found each other, right? And they found to support and care for. And it's my job as trying to help the community. Like every day when I walk in the Mama Bear Clan and I'm working in tent cities, I see my grandpa, every person, whatever they're young, old, middle-aged, whatever, I see my grandfather. And I see what he went through. And I see when he slept on the streets, when he suffered for years and decades and self-harmed. And every time I try to help somebody or I try to give someone assistance, I'm also helping myself, because I'm helping my grandfather, but I'm also helping myself to try to say, I want to do something in my lifetime that does something meaningful, that gives something better to my daughter. And so some days are better and some days are not. And I can tell you that one of the hardest things for us is to do the heavy lifting for Canadians. We're often asked to bear our trauma openly, to talk about these issues. Like it's not, when we give out talks and stuff, this is not easy work, because we're often talking about our own pain, we're talking about our own experiences. And we're doing it not because we, want accolades or want some kind of, attention. We're doing it because we're trying to make a better society for our children, and also I think for Canadian children too. We're trying to make a world in which we can live together and work together. Or as my daughter said one day, she said to me, "Daddy, I want to dance jingle dress in front of the school assembly." And I said, "Don't do that. That's a terrible idea," because my experience in schooling was very full of shame. I also was worried people were going to harm her, make fun of her. And she goes, "Oh, don't worry, Daddy. My friends asked me, and if anybody says anything, they're going to get them." And I tell you that because many of her friends are non-Indigenous. She has allies. I see the allies that she has amongst her group of young 15-year-olds now. And that tells you a lot. I think that when you can be an ally, it means a lot to us. When you can stand beside us when we speak, listen, and then also help us to act to create a better country, all of us that can inherit it together.
Thank you for that, Dr. Sinclair. I wanted to make mention that in the notes, someone was mentioning the education of Augie Marasti. That would be a great book to read. That's actually my late uncle. and my Uncle August. Yeah, that's like Dr. Sinclair was mentioning, some of these stories go deep. And I just remember him always being such a great person, laughing and having, you know, stories around a campfire with my parents and visiting them in La Ronge, where my aunt lived. And I have family up in northern Saskatchewan, but there was this book that that was written, The Education of Augie Marasti, August, Uncle August, as I know him to be, known him to be, now he's passed. But I wanted to go into the questions. And there's one here: the federal government challenges to compensate for children taken into care and their families. How can non-Indigenous Canadians act to get them justice? The foster care system in Canada continues to do untold harm to Indigenous families and communities.
I don't know if Dr. Fontaine wants to get in on this one. I happen to be, because I work in media so much, and I'm in fact, I'm on Power and Politics today talking about this issue. You know, the negotiations right now with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, finding the Canadian government guilty 12 times and guilty of failing to rectify the situation of discrimination for Indigenous First Nations children on reserve and their families, multi-billion-dollar settlement agreement, which Canada has been ordered to pay now numerous times and continues to appeal in court, and says now they're going to have a negotiation to try to find some compensatory package. I can tell you from inside information that the negotiations are currently going well. And that is a good sign that maybe perhaps we can deal with this issue of compensation, which they are owed, rightfully so. They have been discriminated against on First Nations, those children, which led directly to them being in the child welfare system. But let's hope that the changes, I'm far more interested in the changes, because it's clear Canada's perpetrated the harm and has created the situation so dire on First Nations that they're forcibly removed. But that the changes that come out of that system to ensure and support what I think is the proactive solution, which is language supports, dealing with poverty, clean water, decent homes to live in, support systems, youth centers. You know, the fact is that, you know, we have to be able to be proactive, build safe families and communities, and then we won't have this issue of child welfare. We need to not be reactive. The child welfare system is inherently reactive, and therefore it's destructive. It will never be, it's like sending police to deal with pipeline issues. They're only going to come in with brutality. Child welfare system is a brutal system. It only comes in with brutality. Very few people are able to find kindness in that system. Like putting people in hotels is brutal. Removing children, brutal. Giving supervised parental visits, brutal. So the only solution is building safe communities and homes with languages, culture, safe schools, decent governance, you know, all those things that go into building a safe community, which many, you know, the Royal Commission alone, many other reports have done to say this is the solution. Those will solve the child welfare issue and the compensatory issue. Fact is, Canada needs to pay up. They found hundreds of billions of dollars in a weekend when the pandemic happened, which tells you that it's only going to cost about $3 billion to compensate First Nations families and their children. We can do that in 10 minutes? Because the fact is that Canada has done illegal harm, and the only way that Canada knows to solve those harms is to compensate. And then we need to figure out what we're going to do next.
Thank you, Dr. Sinclair. I know that we only have a couple of minutes, but I wanted to ensure that we get to these. Where can they find the research that Dr. Fontaine that you've done? If you can put that up in the chat, that would be wonderful. If you had any other words to say, of course, there's a couple more questions, but I'll just give you the floor there, Dr. Fontaine.
Yeah, so I will put in the chat. We've done over 30 digital stories on the legacy of the schools and also on heart health. And the ones on the legacy of the schools, we have the videos and the report up on the Prairie Women's Health of Excellence. I'll put that up in the chat in a minute. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is trying to upload all the volumes of the videos. Unfortunately, when we purchased our website for the project, it had a shelf life of 10 years. And we didn't realize that. So the videos have been taken down and we have no way of reconstructing the webpage. So we're working with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. They're going to help rebuild the webpage for us. But the heart health research, which is with women in Manitoba, they were all healthcare providers for people with heart health or who had heart health issues, all attributed the heart health issues in our communities to residential schools and having broken hearts. The videos are very powerful. Those are on the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health Research. And then the one that I referred to, on mothering, is on the Prairie Women's Health of Excellence. So I'll put those two links in the chat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fontaine. I also want to ask Dr. Sinclair, how can they access your workshops and how can they essentially, get more information and the workshops that you do? Niigaanwewidam,
Okay.
sorry. Yeah.
I'm just putting my email in the chat here. So formerly my educator workshops were through Inspire, actually the workplace ones as well. I just did Mars Bar Canada. I've just finished the Natural Resources Canada. And I'm doing Fairmont Hotels now. So anyways, so those are the workplace ones, the educator ones. So you can contact me. Normally Inspire was doing them before, but they've during the pandemic, they've reduced their staffing, reduced their things. And so I've been doing it just myself. It may get back up to Inspire, I'm not sure. But as of the moment, I just get booked myself. It's a 4-hour workshop for workplaces. Sorry, my cat is she just wants attention. So the 4-hour workshop for workplaces and for educators for school divisions, it can be anywhere between 4 to 6 hours. And I have done it in 3, but it's a bit too tight. And so,
So that, and also catching you on Power and Politics you're mentioning today, right?
Yeah, I'm on in a couple hours here. So, and we're talking a little bit about the Human Rights Tribunal. We're also talking about, we're talking about apparently the NDP has instituted a new dress code. So that's my topics for today. I don't know why we're talking about that, but I just saw the title. So.
Dress code, that's always fun. But thank you. This has been a really enlightening and also very heartfelt discussion. There is online, if you see the Residential School Survivors Crisis Hotline, if you are feeling triggered and of course needing to have a discussion with a professional, that number is there for you to look at and to reach out to that crisis hotline. I just want to make mention of that, and a lot of discussions that we are having, and I absolutely agree that we need to ensure that we're taking care of ourselves in order to have discussions like these. And I also made sure to really smudge beforehand and to ensure that I'm grounded in having these types of discussions, because working with a lot of leadership, and even during the summer when there was the findings of the burial sites, unmarked graves, I was very much a part of some of the press releases that went out. So anyways, we have Levinia Brown here, and I wanted to allow her to give the last words. How fitting to essentially share some of your thoughts, and we're so thankful that you made it here today. And yeah, I will stop talking and you can have the floor. Thank you, Elder Brown.
Hi, this is Levinia. I think you can see me. Can you hear me okay? I can see myself.
I think someone just needs to mute her. She's got 2 accounts open, so someone needs to, one of the administrators should just mute her second one. Yeah, now she can talk. So.
Yes, I'm trying to get online with you. I'm not.
Don't mute both of them. Mute just one of them. Yeah.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine, Levinia. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, we've been having a problem all afternoon. First, it was a power outage for the whole town for 45 minutes. And then I couldn't get my internet back for some time. And then my phone was acting up, no phone. But my cell phone seemed okay, but the operator kept cutting me off and even said goodbye. So those were the challenges I was having. And Kimberly tried everything to connect me. But if you can hear me okay, yeah, I've been listening to you speaking, all 3 of you, and very interesting topics. And a lot of it is very touchy. For myself, the experience with the residential school in the north has been very devastating as well. And it was kept too silent for so long that it became a problematic to intergenerational path. And we're trying to work hard at it. And a lot of times we have no resources even for trying to get help through mental health nurses and doctors. It's a challenge. We have limited services in the north.
Hello?
Did anybody want to ask me questions?
Yeah, I think we have time for one quick question, and then I definitely know that we are going to just, yeah, ensure that we're on time here. But does anyone have a question here for Elder Brown? Maybe I'll just ask this question. What can people do to help with advocacy and to ensure that and to hold the abusers accountable? That was one of the questions really that was asked. So if you want to just, did you hear that question, Levinia?
Yes, I did. I hear you fine. Yeah, for services, we certainly need a lot more resources, and it's very, very hard to even connect with people down south living up here. And we have only airlines, no roads. So that makes it more difficult. And more programs in the schools that residential school is implemented so that non-Indigenous people are learning about those days. What is residential school? What did happen? What outcome was there? And for myself, I could honestly say thank you for educating us as much as they could, but we couldn't get too much education with too much trauma. And the kids couldn't even teach each other because we all knew we were hurting. So all the kids were good to each other. And we weren't children as growing up because that's how they treated us. We weren't allowed to be children. And they kept us very silent. We couldn't even speak our own language. The only language we knew. We got severe discipline. And what was the other question?
Oh, no, that's great. I am inquiring if it's possible now to give a closing prayer. Know that we are looking at finishing up this portion, and we thank you for making it on. I know that, you know, when power goes out, it's, you know, a difficult situation where you're living up in the north. You know, I just want to ask if you could give us some maybe closing words and a blessing. And thank you very much.
Yes, okay, certainly, and thank the panel too. I recognize you guys. It's nice to see you. And I'm going to say the prayer in Inuktitut. Please pray along with me in your own way. I respect all religion, all faith and belief. And I will just say a short prayer. Nuna leokti guti. Koyan naming angiyumin aksuano. Nuna leokti ikayok daw ta. Amisutigun ikayok daw yakap ta. Igbin kisibin ayungin nabin. Igbin piyuyuyutin. Igbin nagliniuyutin. Ubagon kaway mangin napta sivunik saptinin. Ate kanagaktaw siya laokta. Anne tuuta kaupta, anne tuuta kaupsi kitutuinna. Tuksiuti babun. Ilikku kisiane akigun ng mata. Ayok tuuta kaupta. Ammalu ayok sisimayon. Tuksiuti bakmo. Naglinakmo. Ilaya lokto apta. Tuksiu jota. Kuyan namin nunaleok ti guti. Amma una tuksiang ng atong neaptigo. I like to say the Lord's Prayer with everybody, if we can do that together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed by thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thy is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you so much, Levinia, for your prayers and for closing this session with the panelists. I am just so honored and humbled to be a part of this discussion today, and very, very grateful to the people that helped put this together, including Kimberly Bennett and her staff, on the Voices of the Unheard, the history and the legacy of residential school systems or system here in Canada. So thank you to Dr. Sinclair, Dr. Fontaine, and Levinia Brown for being here today. We appreciate your time and all the work that you're doing to help make a change for future generations. And with the Canadian Race Relations panel, thank you so much. It was an honor to be your moderator today. So thank you. Hi.